What unfolds when a lawyer's racist comment about a black woman in court leads to a shocking realization that could turn the entire case and their perceptions upside down. The courtroom buzzed with low voices and the soft shuffle of papers. Polished shoes tapped across marble floors, briefcases clicked open, and the smell of expensive cologne lingered like a quiet boast. Camille Brooks stepped through the double doors, head high, heels sharp against the tile, her tailored navy suit cutting a sleek silhouette through the room's pale monotony. Every eye didn't turn, just enough did. She moved with purpose, her locks pinned back neatly, a leather case in one hand and generations of resilience in the other. The room, mostly white, mostly male, paused for just a moment, not in greeting, but in assessment. Judgment cloaked in silence. She felt it. She always did. The plaintiff's table sat near the front. She reached it, nodded to her client, an elderly black woman in a simple dress, hands folded tight, and offered a soft word of reassurance. Then she turned to set her files down, her posture straight, calm, prepared. Across the aisle sat Richard Wallace, senior partner. Old money, old views. He wore his gray suit like a shield and his smirk like a weapon. His hair was carefully combed, his tie stiff. He didn't bother hiding the way his eyes narrowed when Camille spoke. Her voice rang clear during the first procedural discussion. Confident, measured, every word clipped with precision. No theatrics, just facts. That was how she worked. Wallace glanced at one of his junior associates, a quick roll of the eyes. The younger man chuckled, too loud for the moment. The bailiff looked up. So did Camille. Briefly. Not enough to give it weight. Not yet. She turned back to her notes. The judge hadn't entered yet. The chatter swelled again. Lawyers swapped last-minute notes. Wallace leaned in and whispered something to his associate. Another laugh. Camille didn't need to hear it to know. She'd heard it before, in conference rooms, depositions, even law school. Too assertive, too bold, too much. The irony was always thick. They called it confidence when it came from him. Called it aggressive when it came from her. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer and tapped the edge of a manila folder. Her client looked at her, eyes unsure. Camille offered a small smile. "We're ready," she said gently. The courtroom doors creaked open. Judge Winthrop entered in his robe, footsteps slow and deliberate. "All rise." Everyone stood. The moment settled like dust in the air. Camille held her ground, spine straight, eyes forward. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to win. And win she would. Camille stood at the center of the courtroom, her voice slicing through the stillness like a scalpel. Every statement was backed by evidence, every citation carefully chosen. She didn't pace or grandstand. She didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight, and today it echoed off the walls of Judge Winthrop's courtroom with steady, deliberate force. Behind her, the jury sat quiet, eyes trained on her. A few leaned in. She painted the picture clearly, a decades-long pattern of redlining, denial of mortgage loans in historically black neighborhoods, and one woman's fight to keep her home after being unfairly targeted. Camille's words didn't just inform, they revealed. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried, with purpose, with power. When she finished, she nodded once toward the judge, then turned and walked calmly back to her table. That's when she heard it. Someone should tell her this isn't a Baptist church. Too loud for court. The words weren't whispered in secrecy. They were tossed like a beer can on the side of the road, meant to be seen, meant to be heard. Camille froze mid-step, just for a second. The words hung in the air, ugly and heavy. A beat of silence followed, thick and unmistakable. Someone in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter's fingers paused. Judge Winthrop lifted his eyes, gaze narrowing beneath silver-rimmed glasses. Camille turned slowly, expression unreadable. Richard Wallace leaned back in his chair, smug, chin lifted like a man who thought he was clever. His associate's smirk was already fading. She said nothing. She didn't need to, because the room had already felt the shift. Respect was no longer the assumption. It was now the demand. And Wallace had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Camille sat down beside her client, who gave her a worried glance. Camille reached for a pen, scribbled a quick note, then slid it aside. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing stayed even. But behind her calm exterior, something began to harden. She had come to argue facts. Now she was a fact. And Wallace had just made the mistake of underestimating her in front of the one person whose opinion mattered most, the judge. Judge Winthrop's gavel tapped gently against the wood. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Thank you for your statement." He shifted his gaze across the courtroom, slow and deliberate, until it landed on Wallace. "We'll proceed, but I believe some behavior may need to be addressed before this court continues." Camille didn't flinch. Wallace blinked. The wind had changed, and the storm was just beginning. The judge's voice broke through the courtroom like a blade through silk. "Counsel, approach the bench." It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Chairs creaked as Camille rose, smooth and composed. Her heels clicked softly against the tile as she made her way forward. Wallace stood, slower, adjusting his tie like he had all the time in the world. That same smug look still plastered on his face. The bailiff shifted, spine a little straighter, hand resting just a touch closer to his belt. Everyone else went still. They reached the bench, standing shoulder to shoulder, separated by a gulf far wider than the few inches between them. Judge Winthrop looked up, folding his hands neatly in front of him. His robe hung heavy over his frame, and his eyes were sharp, thoughtful, the kind that didn't miss much. "I want to be very clear," he began, his tone low but unmistakable. "This courtroom has seen its share of contentious arguments. What it will not see, what it will not tolerate, is disrespect disguised as commentary." Wallace blinked, lips parting, but the judge lifted a single hand. "You don't need to speak. You already did." A slight murmur rippled through the gallery. Wallace's mouth closed again, jaw tightening. Judge Winthrop turned his gaze to Camille. "Ms. Brooks, your conduct has been nothing short of exemplary. You presented your argument with clarity, professionalism, and respect for this court." Camille gave a small nod, hands folded calmly in front of her. She didn't look at Wallace. She didn't have to. The judge continued, his eyes shifting back. "Mr. Wallace, your remark was not only inappropriate, it was offensive. It was rooted in stereotype, soaked in arrogance, and entirely beneath the standards of this court." Wallace tried again, just a breath of protest. "Your Honor, You what?" the judge interrupted, voice still calm, still deadly. "Thought you'd remind us all what black women should sound like in a courtroom?" The air went still. No one breathed. Wallace's face flushed, red creeping up his neck, ears burning. "I suggest you remember where you are," Judge Winthrop said, his words deliberate. "This isn't your firm. It isn't your world to control. And Ms. Brooks isn't someone you get to belittle because her excellence unsettles you." Camille didn't move. Her face remained composed, but inside something steady, something long defended, felt seen. The judge leaned back. "Now, shall we proceed with the matter at hand, or should we take a recess so counsel can reflect on the difference between confidence and contempt?" Wallace gave a small, tight nod. "Very well," the judge said. The lawyers turned back. Camille's walk was just as measured, just as firm. Wallace's steps were slower this time. The balance had shifted, and the whole room felt it. Judge Winthrop didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words moved like slow thunder, controlled, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. "I'm going to say something," he began, folding his hands neatly atop the bench. "And I want everyone in this room to hear it, clearly." The room stilled. Even the court reporter hesitated, pen hovering just above the page. The judge's gaze locked on Wallace, unblinking. What was said earlier about Ms. Brooks being too loud for court was blatantly disrespectful. And let's not pretend otherwise. It was racially charged, and it does not belong in this courtroom. Wallace didn't speak. He wouldn't dare now. His smirk was gone, his eyes fixed somewhere on the judge's desk, as if the wood grain might offer escape. Judge Winthrop continued, voice steady. "This is not a golf club. It is not a boardroom. And it is certainly not a space where power and privilege are allowed to dictate who belongs and who doesn't." A murmur stirred at the back of the gallery. The judge paused, not to regain control, he already had it, but to let his words breathe. "This is a court of law," he said, leaning forward slightly, "and justice, at its core, requires truth. It requires strength. It requires courage. So let me be very clear. Ms. Brooks's voice is exactly the kind of voice this courtroom was built to amplify." Camille didn't flinch. She remained seated, eyes forward, face calm. But inside, something settled, something that had been under pressure for far too long. Judge Winthrop turned his eyes toward the jury box. "We don't silence people here for being passionate. We don't police tone to mask our discomfort. And we certainly don't insult counsel for daring to speak with conviction." He sat back, exhaled softly, then glanced around the room. "If anyone finds that kind of advocacy too loud, I suggest you examine what you're afraid of hearing." No one spoke. Not Wallace, not the other attorneys, not even the clerk flipping through her docket. Camille adjusted a pen on the table. She didn't need to smile. The respect was already hers. Judge Winthrop gave a final nod. "Now, we'll return to the matter at hand, but I trust we all understand what this courtroom stands for." He banged the gavel once, clean and sharp. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. A line had been drawn, and everyone knew who had crossed it. Camille didn't look at Wallace. She didn't have to. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet. Camille sat near the front, 12 years old, feet barely touching the floor, clutching her note cards with fingers that trembled only a little. It was the first round of regional debate. The topic was environmental policy. She had practiced for weeks, facts memorized, arguments airtight, rebuttals ready. Her mother had even timed her speeches with a kitchen timer between grading papers. But the moment Camille stood and began to speak, the eyes told the story. Wide, surprised, dismissive, she spoke clearly. Her voice rose when the facts called for it, dipped when the point needed weight. She wasn't loud. She was focused. But when she finished, the judge, a white man in a red tie and wire-frame glasses, didn't look impressed. He scribbled something quickly on the scoring sheet. A few rows behind, one of the other competitors muttered, "She sounds angry." Later, when the sheets were passed out, Camille saw the comment. "Good facts. Tone was aggressive. Watch your delivery." She read it twice, then again. Aggressive. It echoed in her chest like something sharp and unwelcome. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, quiet, head low. Her mother, in her worn Clark Atlanta sweatshirt, poured 2 mugs of tea and sat across from her. "What happened?" she asked gently. Camille slid the paper across the table. Her mother read it, then looked up. "Did you yell?" Camille shook her head. "Were you rude?" "No, ma'am." Her mother tapped the paper with a short fingernail. "Then what they mean is, they weren't used to hearing a voice like yours speak like it mattered." Camille looked up, confused. Her mother leaned in. "Your voice is your weapon. You hear me? It's the tool you sharpen with truth, and facts and conviction. And when people say you're too much, what they mean is you made them uncomfortable. Good." Camille blinked. Her mother smiled softly. "Never dull your edge just because someone else hasn't learned how to hold it." Those words stayed with her. Through high school, through law school, through every courtroom where her presence was met with raised brows or backhanded compliments. Every time someone said too loud, too passionate, too bold, she remembered that kitchen table, that mug of tea, that woman who raised her not just to speak, but to command. Camille looked down at her notes now, in this courtroom, decades later. Her handwriting was neater, her voice stronger. But that little girl with the note cards? She was still here, and she'd never stopped speaking. The witness fidgeted on the stand, fingers tapping against the water glass beside him. Camille stood just a few feet away, voice smooth as silk, but sharp as a scalpel. "So, to clarify," she said, taking a slow step forward, "you denied Mrs. Hamilton's loan application after she met every listed financial requirement: credit score, income, employment history. Is that correct?" The man cleared his throat. "Well, there were additional considerations." "Were those considerations listed in the policy manual?" she asked, holding up a printed binder with the bank's logo on the cover. He hesitated. But Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Did you apply those same considerations to the white applicants approved that same month?" The man blinked. The jury leaned forward. I'd have to check." She offered a tight, polite smile. "We already did." She turned toward the jury box, then back to the witness. "So again, Mr. Lansing, was the denial based on criteria, or was it based on something else?" The silence dragged. Camille stepped back, giving the man space to sink into it. "Nothing further," she said, and returned to her seat. The courtroom murmured. Even the judge looked up from his notes. Wallace stood stiffly, adjusted his tie, and called for a break. In the hallway, tension buzzed beneath the fluorescent lights. Wallace's team huddled near the water cooler. Camille leaned against the wall near the courtroom doors, flipping through her notes, calm, collected. Wallace walked past, then stopped. "You people always play the victim," he snapped, voice low but full of venom. Camille didn't look up right away. She let the words hang. Let them show themselves for what they were. Then she closed her folder, slowly, met his eyes. "What people is that, Mr. Wallace?" He opened his mouth, closed it. A flicker of regret? Numbered just fear he'd said it too loud. She stepped toward him, just enough. "You're not losing this case because of race," she said, her voice steady. "You're losing it because you underestimated the facts. And me." Wallace looked away, jaw clenched. His team shifted uncomfortably. Camille took a breath, then turned back toward the courtroom. Let him sit in it. The jury would return soon. The case would keep moving. But the balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. Wallace wasn't unraveling because of her voice. He was unraveling because she was right, and because the courtroom, finally, was listening. The courtroom felt colder than it had all day. Not from the air conditioning, but from the shift. The kind of shift that comes when patience runs out and consequences knock on the door. Judge Winthrop set his pen down, carefully, deliberately. Then he looked up, his expression hard to read but impossible to ignore. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he said flatly. "Counsel, remain in the room." Chairs scraped, people rose, but no one moved far. Reporters in the back leaned forward, fingers flying across keyboards. One already had his phone out, pretending to check the time. Everyone knew something was coming. Camille remained seated, calm. Her client reached for a tissue, eyes wide. Camille gave her a nod, just enough to steady her. Judge Winthrop removed his glasses and set them beside his file. "Before we proceed further," he said, "I need to address conduct that has not only disrespected this court, but also undermined the dignity of the profession." His gaze cut across the room like a blade. It landed on Wallace, who stood stiffly, arms crossed. "Mr. Wallace, this isn't about a single comment anymore. It's about a pattern. You've insulted opposing counsel. You've undermined the decorum of this courtroom. And now," he paused, "you've crossed a line that cannot be walked back." Wallace's mouth opened. "Your Honor, I think this is being taken out of No," the judge said, voice sharper now. "What's out of context is your understanding of professionalism." A low hum rippled through the room. One reporter muttered, "He's done," under his breath. Winthrop continued, "Effective immediately, I am submitting a formal complaint to the State Bar regarding your behavior. That includes the racial undertones in your remarks, your conduct during cross, and your flagrant disregard for this court's standards." Wallace's face went pale, then red. "I was just—" The judge didn't let him finish. "You were just showing us exactly who you are. And now, we'll treat that accordingly." Silence fell like a curtain. Even the bailiff looked away. Camille didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply folded her notes and set her pen aside. Because the gavel hadn't even dropped yet, and still, the verdict was already written in the air. Wallace looked like a man unraveling in slow motion. Not because he'd lost a case, but because he'd finally been seen, fully, truthfully. And that truth had weight. The kind of weight that could end a career. The jury filed back into the room, eyes straight ahead, faces unreadable. The hum of tension returned, low and electric, curling around the silence like smoke. Camille stood slowly, smoothing her blazer with one hand. Her client, Mrs. Hamilton, gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale against brown skin. Camille reached over, gently covering the woman's hand with her own. Across the aisle, Wallace didn't move. His jaw was locked, eyes fixed on the foreperson, like he could will a different truth into existence. But the truth was already settled. The bailiff took the verdict slip, walked it to Judge Winthrop with the gravity of someone carrying more than paper. The judge glanced at it once, then cleared his throat. "In the matter of Hamilton versus Fairview Lending," he began, his voice steady, "has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor." "And what is your decision?" A pause. "We find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded, $2.3 million. The words landed like thunder muffled in velvet. No gasp, no applause, just a ripple of air, a shift in gravity. Camille's client blinked once, lips parting. Her shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in release. Years of tension dissolving in an instant she never truly believed would come. Camille gave her hand a gentle squeeze. No words. None were needed. Across the courtroom, Wallace looked like he had swallowed glass. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. He glanced toward the judge, then toward his own team, who suddenly had 100 reasons not to meet his eyes. Judge Winthrop tapped the gavel once, final. "This court is adjourned." The sound echoed louder than it should have. Camille gathered her things with practiced ease, her motions smooth, unrushed. Her client still hadn't spoken. Tears welled quietly in the corners of her eyes, the kind that came not from sadness, but from the sudden absence of injustice. They stood together. Outside the courtroom doors, reporters waited with cameras and microphones and rehearsed questions. But Camille didn't rush to meet them. Instead, she looked at Mrs. Hamilton and said softly, "You did it." The older woman smiled through her tears. "We did." Camille nodded, her own throat tight. Because this verdict wasn't just numbers on a page, It wasn't just justice served. It was a message, spoken not with noise but with clarity. And that message would echo far beyond these walls. The courthouse doors swung open with a heavy groan. Camille stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the sky streaked with fading gold. Reporters surged forward like a tide, microphones raised, voices overlapping, shouting her name, firing off questions, hungry for a headline. She didn't flinch, didn't bask in the attention, didn't glance at the cameras tracking her every move. She walked calmly down the steps, her client beside her, hands still trembling from the weight of justice finally delivered. Someone shouted, "Ms. Brooks, any comment on the verdict?" Another, "Do you feel vindicated after what was said in court?" Flashes lit up like tiny lightning bolts. Audio recorders inched closer. Camille paused at the bottom step. She could have said a lot. She could have talked about systemic bias, about the statistics, the years, the microaggressions dressed up as manners. She could have recounted the smirks, the whispers, the way her tone was dissected more than the facts she presented. But she didn't. She looked out over the crowd, at the phones, the notepads, the curious eyes, and she said just one thing. "If my voice was too loud for court," she said, her tone quiet but unwavering, "maybe court's been too quiet for too long." A hush swept through the press line. No follow-up, no applause, just silence, pregnant and heavy with meaning. And then the moment passed. The reporters scrambled. Questions fired again. But Camille didn't stop. She turned and walked toward the car waiting at the curb, her client beside her, the heels of her shoes clicking steady against the pavement like punctuation marks. The clip hit social media within the hour. A local journalist uploaded it with the caption, "Civil rights attorney Camille Brooks drops truth outside Atlanta courthouse." Within minutes, it was shared, then reshared, then everywhere. Thousands of comments, a thread of praise, a current of anger, a wave of realization. A voice, once called too loud, now amplified across every screen in the country. And through it all, Camille didn't check the headlines. She didn't need to. She hadn't spoken to go viral. She had spoken because it was true, because too many people had been silenced in rooms just like that courtroom, because power, real power, doesn't always shout, it resonates. And now her voice wasn't just heard, it was remembered. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, with her name written in dark ink, Camille Brooks, Esquire, in careful, deliberate handwriting. No return address, just a courthouse seal in the corner. It arrived quietly, tucked between a client file and a utility bill on her office desk. She almost missed it. She opened it slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the folded stationery. Inside, a handwritten note, black ink, clean lines, no formal letterhead. Just the unmistakable penmanship of someone who had spent decades writing in longhand before email replaced etiquette. It was from Judge Harold Winthrop. Camille leaned back in her chair, reading. "Ms. Brooks, I've presided over many cases in my time, some forgettable, some unforgettable. Yours was the latter, not because of the outcome, though it was just, not because of the media, though it was loud, but because of how you carried yourself through it all. I want to thank you. Thank you for your composure in the face of insult, for your professionalism when others abandoned theirs, for your clarity when it was easier to be silent. You reminded this courtroom, and perhaps this profession, what true advocacy looks like. Some believe power is loud by nature. You proved it can also be quiet, firm, and relentless, and still be heard. The law is nothing without people brave enough to speak truth through it. Never lower your voice. The bench is listening. H.W. Camille sat still for a moment, the letter resting lightly in her lap. Outside her window, the city moved on without her. Cars weaving through late traffic, the distant rumble of construction, a siren wailing somewhere far off. But in that moment, all she could hear were those last words, not from the bench, from the man behind it. Never lower your voice. She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the top drawer of her desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The courtroom may have gone quiet, the verdict long since decided, but the fight, the greater one, was still out there, and she had no intention of whispering through it.